Hey, my dudes. Welcome back to the Babbling Pastors Podcast with your amazing host, Rob, and me.
Yeah. Truly amazing. Yeah.
Yes.
hmm
Mind-blowing, world-changing, life-altering. I don't know if I have anything else.
Yeah. I think you summed it up pretty well.
There you go. So that's who you have over here on one side of your screen, and then over here you have me, the balding middle-aged man. So today we're going to be talking about more specifically
So we should clear up. We're going to be talking about sin in the church at some point this month, and so just to cover it, before we jump into
get it out.
Everything that was just said, at least all the good things about us, absolutely untrue. So go ahead. Go ahead.
So last week, if you tuned in, we covered the state of church denominations, talked about probably 4 of them, and basically I'll let you listen to that so you can come to kind of the conclusion of what was sort of agreed upon. But today we're going to be specifically diving into a pretty big subject that's happened within the church in general. Again, not to necessarily like call out the SBC, but that it's the most recent example of it. So we're gonna be talking about abuse within the church. One of the reasons I think this is important, obviously, abuse has to be dealt with within the church, but also it's one of the primary reasons that people either leave the church or like have maybe a bad taste about the church in their mouths or just don't attend anymore. And that's a wide range of abuse. I mean, you could be talking about just mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, just abuse of power in general. Like that, all of these are terrible things that really compromise the message of Christ. And specifically, and I just for full disclosure, I haven't read hardly any of the report that the SBC came out with abuse, other than knowing that sort of as a springboard into this conversation, apparently there was a list of like 700 pastors, not all of them associated with the SBC currently, but at one point or another maybe were on a list of pastors that had, I guess if I understood it correctly, were pastors that they were like, you need to watch these dudes. But they were still within some sort of ministry position. And that really caused, I would say, a reasonable outroar that a lot of these men were still in ministry. Well, not all of them, but a good majority of them were still in ministry. And that was just, if I understand the report correctly, that was just sexual abuse. That doesn't even touch the abuse of power, spiritual abuse, mental abuse, anything like that. So have you just, we haven't talked about this, but are you aware of the report? Have you read any of it or no?
No. I'm aware of it, and I've certainly heard lots of things about it. It's on my screen right now, but
yeah, it's like 300 pages. I don't think you're gonna get through it.
No. Yeah, no, I've definitely heard of it and heard a lot of commentary on it and that sort of thing. So, not an expert, won't claim to be. But I think again, though, what you said is important, that we're not necessarily only talking about the SBC. So it's not like we're here to be experts in that specific report anyway. But it's more about the whole idea that this happens, that there is abuse in the church, and I know, it wasn't, but it seemed like about 5 minutes ago that all of the evangelical world was in uproar because of the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, right? Probably right while some of this abuse was going on. Right?
Yeah.
And so the sin in the camp when it comes to that kind of thing is certainly, knows no bounds, right? And I mean, even pastors who or Christians for that matter, but the subject specifically there is pastors or people in leadership roles that abuse. But everybody in those kinds of roles, you have to have some sort of accountability. You have to assume that you're capable, right, of making those kinds of terrible decisions. And there's a pastor that once told me that every one of us is only 2 or 3 bad decisions in a chain from being in prison for the rest of our lives. I mean, which is true. I mean,
Yeah.
all it's going to take is a chain of a few moments of extreme weakness in which we give in, that would lead to something that drastic and what sounds crazy now. So, but the abuses, and I'm sure if we were to be honest about it and everything, like when at the end of days, when all is laid bare, right, we're going to hear about lots of other of these instances. And it's not only abuse, it's affairs that happen in the church that don't get talked about or dealt with or whatever else, or the rampant pornography that has made its way through the church. And so it's a huge problem, but abuse specifically, that's the subject of our discussion right now. I mean, I think all of the other things that I just mentioned lead to that kind of behavior too. And the church has really missed the boat in the past couple of generations. Specifically, I can't speak to generations before that really, but could be true there as well. But we tend to really miss the boat on teaching even our children in the next generation about sex, about marriage. And apparently now, right? I mean, it's gone a lot further than that when it comes to identity and gender and your gender roles, right? Which is not, it's a stupid phrase even. But yeah, I don't know. The abuse in the church is a real thing. And it needs to be dealt with like a real thing, not just avoided or ignored, or there. And churches that haven't experienced it need to have plans in place, or some kind of how are we going to deal with it scenario put in place, right? So,
yeah, no, a couple things on that. One, not that it's a great theological discord or anything, but I remember watching the Hotel Rwanda, and that was what you were talking about is everybody is capable. There was a line in that I will never forget that the reporter's like asking, like, how does this happen? And he goes, what do you mean? Everyone is capable of doing that. I take your food away and wait until 2-3 days, you become a totally different person than you were before, because now you're in survival mode. And I think that's a great point that you made. Like, everyone is capable of doing a myriad of things that no one thinks you're actually capable of until you start down a path in which, like you said, the things you mentioned lead to something else. So, the one little step you get away with, then you get another way with another little step, and then you just keep going down that path. And that bears itself true a lot when you read a lot of these reports about people that have been caught in it. It never starts with that. It's always littler things that they've gotten away with that lead to that. And the great point you made, I think, there at the end was like, if your church hasn't been through it, the best thing you could do right now is learn from the other accounts. Like I just preached on 1 Corinthians 5, and I was like, there's no church discipline that I'm aware of that needs to happen in the church, but the best time to learn how to do church discipline is when you don't have any. Like you now know, hey, this is the biblical outline of what to do if something does happen, instead of trying to put it together when it does. And so to learn, like, okay, what policies do we have in place? What are the accountability structures? Like, who do you report something to if you feel like, I mean, don't wait till something happens, and have those in place that people know about. Like, so reading through a lot of, there's obviously a ton of one of the things that I do find progressive websites or progressive accounts online helpful for is that they'll point this out left and right. Like anytime a report comes out, they'll post about it. And what you do find in all of these is like the accountability structures just weren't there. And if there was some semblance of accountability, like there was one recently that somebody posted about, it was a father and son, pastor and youth pastor, and they just protected each other, which just sounds like the most insane thing in the world that would even happen, but it did. And like you said, like you look at that and you go, how does that happen? Well, like like nobody thinks that's possible until you
Yeah.
read a report about that happening and you go, what kind of insanity is that?
Yep.
And so to put in place structures where you can be like, all right, well, obviously these two guys being accountable to each other clearly didn't work and was clearly doomed for failure from the beginning. So what kind of situations do we have set in place? And um one of the things that I think in this discussion that's really important is that, like, don't count on your denomination to give that to you or people
Mm-hmm.
over you. Like it should, something like, if your local church members don't know who they can talk to if something happens, or if they can, how to bring an account. This is why I'm a huge proponent of a plurality of elders, not just one guy.
Yeah.
Because now this is, everyone keeping, or at least deacons that, you can take something to. But I think you're setting, if you're a parachurch, especially, and you got one visionary leader like that's problematic, and you're just asking for problems at that point. But
Yeah, and it's it is a problem of one. Uh, well, I think that there's so much that goes into those situations. Um, One, I think that the church has a major problem in even selecting and vetting pastors.
mm-hmm.
We've gotten into a place in the life of the church in which, um, if you have, and every denomination's different. I was a teenager still, and some little mom and pop church in a town not far away from where we lived in Corden that had, when I say little, there were like 8 old people in the church, and that was it, right? Like it was just a little room with a, and they were like, "Come be our pastor," and it's like, to me, they say this because I went and preached a couple of times to them, right? Um, and I had no business being my own spiritual. I like that. I didn't know anything about. Like I
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have been preaching at all, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of them have like no standards except, yeah, we know him, you know, he's a pal, or he preached a couple of times and he's a good speaker or whatever,
Or he'll
and
show up.
or that, yep, or he said yes, right. But I also think that there's in some other places it's like, oh, you have an MDiv, cool, you can be our
Mm-hmm.
pastor, right? And it doesn't go past, you know, the vetting, the, you know, um, you have the right degrees or you interview well.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the secular world in any sort of leadership role has had this situation happen where someone is a great interviewer, right? And then that's like where
Terrible
the
worker.
greatness ends, right?
Yeah.
You know, like this dude is great. He's going to be awesome. And then he doesn't show up for work. You know what I mean? Like everyone's dealt with that
Yes.
in the secular world. I don't know why we think that somehow, a weekend of hearing him preach, maybe his only good sermon, his best thing, you know, and like,
Yeah. Why would you not think
like,
he wouldn't bring his A game
yeah,
for the practice life?
absolutely. The extensive, so there's not to jump into the weeds and take too long on this, but one of the churches across town just in the last couple of years hired an associate pastor, and I mean it was extensive. The guy went through essentially like what you would go through to be ordained, those kinds of interviews. That they walked through his entire theological perspective, asked him like ridiculous questions that were just hard questions. They talked to his wife and his family without him. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that was discussed, and you know, that's the kind of thing that should be happening.
Yeah.
Not only nowadays, in my mind, if I'm interviewing somebody and they say, "Hey, I got an MDiv at such and such," I'm gonna go, "Okay, well, who were your professors, right? Like, what did you take?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the problems at that institution or whatever, right? Because so many of the big ones are like, at least closet CRT people, right? At this point. So vetting the pastor in the first place is a problem, right? And then accountability around the pastor, as you mentioned, is another problem. That's the whole reason that the Driscoll thing blew up. Frankly, if there would have been accountability from the beginning and he would have been discipled and put in his place as a young man, you might be looking at a completely different picture.
Yeah. Well, now even his whole church is, I mean, I think on his staff page, at least 2 of his kids are on staff. So they're not going to call him out.
Well, no. And the same stuff is happening there now that happened at Mars Hill. The same exact crap. And so that's just one of the most public example maybe, but accountability around the pastor is important. And then the spiritual life of the pastor is important. That spiritual leader needs to not just be checking boxes and reading our daily bread, right? Like that's a joke. I mean, the problems are really deep. I think deeply ingrained into how we do, how we hire, what we expect of pastors, and all of that. But I think another avenue is what's on the plate of your pastor. What's the role of elder and pastor in the at least boil it down to the very minimum point of having an elder, which pastor, elder, same. Having an elder in the New Testament, what does Peter say verbatim? Right, that they were meant to pray and preach the gospel, like that. Essentially, the spiritual well-being of the church, right? And now we have pastors that do all of the ministry in some churches.
Well, I mean, that's why in Acts they are specifically like, hey, get some godly men to do all of this extra stuff.
Yeah,
we have other things to do.
Yeah, you have single pastors who do all of the deacon kind of work, all of the ministry leader work. They're the Awana leader. They're the whatever else, right? And it's not correct, and it's not fair. And you're setting them up to be the only person with any power until it blows up and you find out that they're struggling with something that they shouldn't have been dealing with in the first place.
I think that's a great point to settle on just for a second. The idea that, and it's not something that I've really considered before, but that's a great point. And the idea that they're dealing with all of it. So not only do they have centralized power over every ministry, maybe not even at their own doing, maybe just there was a bunch of lazy Christians that didn't want to do anything and they've stepped up to do it. But even in stepping up to do it, now they're in control of everything. And that added stress, now they look for a way to get rid of that stress, which again might lead into alcoholism or addiction of other kind, or just again down a path that's absolutely terrible. And not that that's an excuse, but that's just how the human psyche works. Stressed out people find ways to release that stress that almost always lead to sin if it's dealt with unhealthily. So you have, I think that's a really good point that I don't know if I've ever considered before or even looked at. Like that, having all of that on your plate is going to lead to bad places.
Well, and I even know from the way that it happened here, that I mean, it's a completely different thing, right? Like I've been a church leader in some capacity for about over 10 years before I was full-time here, what I'm doing now. And it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing when you, there's no escape now, right? Like if you're the leader of a ministry, you can say, you know what, guys, go to the elders. I need to take a step back for, a couple of months or for this year, or we need to shut her down for the summer because I need to refresh. Like I just need to, be with my family, but you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. Like I can't do that. So, and it's something that you should prepare for, but it's something you can't be prepared for, if that makes sense. The preparation for that kind of thing, in which you're doing more or whatever. Now, granted, our elders are excellent men, and they watch out for me in ways that that every elder, every plurality of elders should. Um, they go to my wife behind my back and say, "Hey, how's he sleeping?" I mean, those kinds of things, right? And so, um, but there there are things that were put in place for me from the beginning. Every last Friday of the month is my day. Unless someone dies, I don't have a job, right? And I don't have a family either. I go alone and be with God, period. Whatever that might look like on a given month. Before noon, unless it's an emergency, the office staff doesn't call me or bother me. They take messages, whatever, and it's just me and God. That's when I do sermon writing, my devotions, extracurricular reading, seminary stuff, all of that, my study, my God time, and I have a whole first half of the day for that.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that you should be doing for your pastor. Not that everybody needs that exact thing, but you get what I'm saying. It's you gotta care for the spiritual health of the pastor. And if you go into a situation like this, having been through some hard things, right, and already knowing maybe some of the ways you don't deal well with stress, or already having some mechanisms in place, already having matured past the point that, that, okay, when I'm stressed, maybe my habit should be crying out to God in prayer with the door closed, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe we should do a David day.
Just gonna get some sackcloth and ashes in here.
Yeah, right. But all of that helped, right? And yet today, what you see is a lot of times is guys coming straight from a seminary who haven't ever had a job except for maybe Burger King or something, and then they go to seminary, and then they are pastors, and it's like, you don't know anything about life, man.
Yeah.
Haven't been through anything yet, most of them. And so that's not to knock anybody. It's just to say, there are pastors being put in place as pastors that it's unfair to them that they've been put in that role yet.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, because I was talking to, I don't know if it was my pastor or who was it? My memory is terrible. Anyway, we were talking about that though, where it came up where I was like, I'm glad I haven't been put in a pastoral role yet, because if I would have been before this point, man, that would have been terrible in regards to how to deal with stress, knowing how I deal with it, knowing my break off point, knowing, I had to learn all that in the retail world in a management position where there was stress and there was pushing and there was where you're going to put up boundaries. But a lot of people just don't, there isn't that development in a lot of people's lives until now. Now, you're careening off a cliff and you don't know how to deal with it, and you don't have any structures in place. And then you either crash or burn or learn to swim really fast. And like you said, there's a lot of positions in which, so in college, we had a lot of internships. We had to go, be around a lot of pastors, but that is still night and day difference when you're by yourself and you have to deal with all of that on your plate. And I think that's a great point. If you don't have mechanisms in place, if you don't know who you are, if you don't know how you deal with things or how to correctly deal with those things, and you don't have people looking out for you, I think that's key there. Like you were talking about, your elders go and ask your wife about your sleeping habits. That I laugh, but that's a great thing. Do you have someone that's even checking up on you, that cares enough about you to do that? And that is, I would say, incredibly rare, if I had to guess, that happens. And so now you have a bunch of young guys. Now, again, like you said, not to knock them, but there's a reality in which they haven't had that life experience. They haven't had the stress of to the point to where you're like, I'm about to have a mental breakdown. So they don't know how to deal with it. And they're dealing with it in the moment as their pastors with typically no one watching. and it's ending badly. So, I mean, not just the sexual abuse stuff, but then you lash out in abusing your power. You lash out in abusing your authority over people. You lash out in because you're super smart. So you can, you don't see it as spiritual abuse, but that's what you're doing. And so there's all of these things that are trickle down effects that, like you said, everybody sees later. You see the aftermath of it, but there's not a lot of preparing on the front side of how do I like, and without those mechanisms in place, you're really just guessing how you'll react to it. And then you have the fallout of all of this terrible things that happen that leave like incredibly deep scars on people's lives. Just that really, not that it would all be solved, but a huge amount of it would be taken care of with care and forethought, like purposeful things put in place. That just aren't typically. So no, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the care for, so back in, someone might point back to like the reformer days, right? When you had guys like Jonathan Edwards or John Calvin or, and these guys, like John Calvin wrote the Institutes of Christian Religion, which is like his most famous work in his 20s, right? Jonathan Edwards did all, he died really, he died before we are alive right now. Like he died really young, and yet he wrote tons of great theological works and is celebrated, right? But we don't take into account the, I think often the place that our culture is in, the church culture specifically. When you have a generation of guys coming up on, whatever YouTube, Twitter, now TikTok, garbage is out there, and they're being discipled more by, the parents are turning them over to the church or to the public school or to whatever forum that's not them to disciple them. There's so many things that factor in now that that stunt the growth and maturity of men and women. And so women can brag about the developing quicker all they want. But it's a both sexes are stunted in their growth, and especially their spiritual growth at this point in history because of the culture around us. And so you can't assume because a guy has been a good church boy his whole life, or seemingly anyway, and has a degree, a couple of degrees, and his interview's good. You can't assume that the guy's bulletproof or that he's even gotten any of that figured out yet about stress. One of the things at the seminary, so I just began seminary again, and we're partnering, our church is partnering with Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, and there are a couple of guys from our church that are attending as well and going for their bachelor's, and that is one of the things that they put in place is mentorship. It's a big thing. It's not just, talk with the guy every couple of minutes or every couple of months or whatever. For those guys, it's a little bit different for me because I'm already in the role. So I have a mentor, but it looks different. But for those two guys who aren't in this role, they have to actually have preaching time at some point. They actually have to walk with me through funeral and wedding things when that comes up. They have to have Bible study leading experience, Sunday school experience, all the while keeping up with their family life and their spiritual walk and everything else. Like, it's an all hands on deck, invading all areas of your life, sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way that it should be. And yet, I think that we really are doing a terrible job at preparing young men for the roles that they're thrust into. And honestly, I think if we did that better, that would help a lot of the issues.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did that better, and then once they were in those roles, there were men around them, punching them in the guts when they needed it, and whatever else. Um, but even so often, as we talked about just briefly in the last episode, so often now they're not even being trained in seminaries that believe Scripture is inerrant and the Word of God and infallible and whatever. So it's kind of a conundrum.
Yeah. Well, I think to your point on like Jonathan Edwards or Calvin or even, I mean, you're just talking about just in general, no name pastors that no one's ever heard of the last couple
Yeah.
centuries.
Mm-hmm.
It was a different culture in regards to you were brought up in the church, you were brought up in homes that typically, again, this, I'm not to paint them all with a rose colored brush here, but typically would teach you doctrine and theology as part of the family life.
Mm-hmm.
And culture was set up that way as well. Again, not as a broad reality, but it was a cultural reality that church was sort of the central part of the community. So you did have people that would just by nature be developed more theologically and maturity wise because of what had to happen and what had to be done. So you had guys that were a lot younger that were you had probably, like you said, 20-year-olds that could like preach, a 50-year-old into the table nowadays, just because of the theological training they'd received at home and the maturity level they had based upon just the realities of life that they had to do. I mean, reading, my wife loves visiting like old towns and whatever in the mountains that that are abandoned now, but all of these
Sure.
histories are, I mean, these young men and women, like by the time they were like 15, were like, all right, we got to start a family soon. We've got, I mean, they had all of these things, the realities of life, of how to grow things, how to take care of things, how to survive. And you throw a 14-year-old out in the world now and they're like, I need water and television and where's my phone? And like there's just not
Yeah,
there's
for
just
sure.
you do some adults that way and they're just
Yeah.
like, I don't know what to do. And you just don't have that anymore. And I think, like you said, I mean, all that aside, that's not coming back. So what do you do then? Well, like you said, I think all of the things you've mentioned up to this point are incredibly important. The idea that you would hire a pastor and not sit them down and ask them what their soteriology was, what their eschatology was, if they could explain, what do you believe about the Trinity? Like, what, I mean, all of these things, being able to speak to them and not asking those questions is like, why would you do that? Why would you hire someone assuming they're coming from outside of the church and you don't know
Mm-hmm.
them from anybody? Like, why would you not put them through a gauntlet? These are the people that are going to be leading your people.
Yeah.
And to not get references and to not ask those questions and to not interview their family is, I don't know, what are you doing, man? I mean,
Well,
that's
and two, so let's think about it from the perspective of elder and pastor, same word, right, in Scripture, um, would fulfill much of the same offices, uh, at least tasks and things like that, right?
Mhm.
Like the elders that Timothy put in place would have preached, right, and done those kinds of things. So let's think about that for a second, because per Scripture, would not the best avenue be what happened here? Would not the best avenue, the thing that should be hoped for and prayed for, is that we would be the kind of church that would raise up men
Mm.
who, I mean, we get our elders from within the church. What's the
Yeah.
difference? You single out a man, or God singles out a man, or both tend to happen. God singles out a man by us
Affirming, yeah.
recognizing gifts and that sort of thing. And then, like, why is that such a disconnect? You know what I mean? Like that, because nowhere in the New Testament, or nowhere are we seeing young men um, from Ephesus running off to college and then running off to seminary and then going in for a weekend in Corinth, and you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's not something you get from Scripture. Not that that's all terrible, but I'm just saying, like, That's not it's become the path that is expected, that must be taken. How about let's just think about raising up men that would qualify in the first place? Because as we've talked about before in this podcast, the qualifications for elders are simply qualifications for a godly man, right?
Yeah.
But to be an elder, you have to be a godly man, and that's the point, right?
Yeah.
So if we have churches that are filled more with elder material men than non, then and those men are being pushed and pursued and spurred on. What's to say that we can't change that dynamic? Maybe send. I mean, in this world, we're at a point that you don't have to send someone away even to get a solid seminary trained situation. And the church, the local church, in my view, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it or say others are terrible people, but the local church should be the ones that they know the man better than anyone. They should be the ones raising men up, sending men off, and then bringing them back to serve.
Yeah.
That's the best scenario anyway.
Yeah, no, I would be in agreement with that. And I think to kind of tie the episode up, I think that right there's not going to be any silver bullet to prevent abuse, but there are preventative measures, I think, all of which you've mentioned in this episode, that are going to work in ways that are going to help a lot. And the only way I think that like that really starts to take effect, people, because one of the answers is, well, how do you not every church is going to do that. Well, no, they're not. But I think one of the best ways to do it is very much like a Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego situation, where you go, look, we're going to do it, and then you can assess us later. Like, I'm not saying all of you have to do it. I'm just saying this is the way we're doing it. And, a couple years we can compare stats and we can see what churches do have abuse and what churches don't have abuse based upon basic practices in which you can say, this is how we do it and this is why we do it. And these are the results of that. And I think, honestly, if you had a church, like you said, putting in place the things that, that are as best a preventative measures as anything else, and living that out, and a decade later can point back and say, like, we haven't had these issues, and when they started to show themselves, these preventative measures nipped it in the bud. And really just stand before the church at the end and be like, we did it different and it clearly worked, not in a braggadocious way, but in a way that says, like, I think you're 100% accurate when you're saying that, like, you raise them up, you send them off, you bring them back. The idea that there would have to be somebody that has to have somebody come guest preach because the pastor's out of town that week seems incredibly asinine to me. You should have guys in the church that can fill that role. There should be no reason to bring in somebody from the outside to do that, except for, like, special occasions, missionaries. I mean, there's things in which that'll take place, but to have somebody come in because nobody's here to preach, you have a whole church full of dudes and no one else can preach but the pastor. There, like, no one else is qualified. So to do that, I think, would be a great measure to put in place. Do you have anything to end that with?
Yes, and the only thing that we haven't talked about, and this should be brief, it doesn't need to be lengthy at all, is we've talked a lot about preventing and preventative measures, right?
Yeah.
And rightfully so, because preventative measures prevent, right? So if all of what we've been talking about were in place, you wouldn't have the SBC report. You know what I mean? I don't think that would be what it is. However, it's there, right? Yeah. I mean, we're already in a place where this kind of thing happens. So, what do you do? Like, what do you do in your church when something like that happens? Tom Askell actually was quoted when he was talking about this before the thing came out. Tom Askell said that it's not sin in the church that destroys the church. It is dealing with sin inappropriately or not at all that destroys the church. And so as a church, when you run into something, it comes out, for instance, that someone is, if it's an actual abuse situation, what should you do? Try to handle it in house, or should you go directly to the authorities? Right? If someone comes in, somebody comes in my office, or sits down with one of our elders, this has actually happened. Not on a large scale situation, and it was an abuse within the church. It was someone who's been abused that was in our church. But when that happens, you immediately go to the authorities. You go to the police. They're the people God has put in place and instituted for the specific purpose of maintaining law and order according to God's standards. And so when an actual abuse situation comes to light, call the police. I mean, that's what you do. And if it's not an abuse situation, meaning it is found out that someone is struggling with pornography, right? That's not against the law, unfortunately. But when that gets found out, right, then that still needs to be dealt with. You don't call the police because the police are going to laugh at you, right?
Yeah, they'll be like, what?
But you do go to the person. Let's think about Matthew 18. Just look at that episode last week, right, or last year. Because that's how you handle sin in the church, period. And so these things, before they become abuse, before they get put into that scenario or made into that level, they should be handled anyway already within the church. And if we're all in one another's lives enough, we're going to know those things about one another. You shouldn't be allowed to go to church and slip out and never be known or noticed, right? That's part of being the church. And so if it's a sin issue only, then it should be dealt with, not ignored, not condoned, none of that, but actually dealt with within the church according to the standards in Scripture. If it is a criminal thing, then you automatically pull the trigger, go to the authorities, and then walk with the authorities and that person through the situation as the church.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Yeah, we didn't cover that at all, so I'm glad you brought that up, because there will be situations in which those aren't put in place and abuse does happen, and it has to be dealt with. And I think that's a great point back to the episode we did. There are proper ways to deal with that person.
Yep.
And I think one of the things we do overlook, unfortunately, is the calling of authorities, because they're like, well, that's not in there. Well, there are certain things that have to be addressed at a very high level in regards to stop them from happening again. So no, that's great. I think that's very helpful, because again, most churches don't have those preventative measures, and therefore things will happen. So you have to know how to deal with them. So good call on that. All right, guys. So we'll see you next week as we continue to dive deeper into these more specific issues that we've talked about. Hopefully you found that helpful. If you did, make sure you like, share it, do all those things as well. Next week, we are going to be talking about the acceptance of various sins within the church, what that looks like, and the effects that causes just ripple wise throughout the entire Big C church. So we'll talk to you then. Bye.
Later.